Right, good afternoon, everyone. Glad to see so many people on this call, which I've been personally looking forward to for quite some time. In fact, ever since it was suggested by Jeff, who's on the call this afternoon, who had heard, hi Jeff, heard Mark speak at another event and said this would be absolutely right for CMCE. And I thought for a moment, yeah, this is all about economics. It's not kind of what we deal with. We deal with consulting practice and the issues around it. But it was when I started to think about the issues around it that I thought, well, this is absolutely slap bang in what we should be talking about. Because if you're a regular in the network, you'll know that what we like to do is raise questions that are perhaps difficult for consultants to think about or take you out of the comfort zone of your day-to-day business of delivering value to clients. So this is, I'm hoping this session will encourage you to maybe step back a bit and think, what is the bigger picture here of what I'm doing and what my client is doing?
We're going to kick off the proceedings by just asking you a couple of poll questions up front. So if we could just unveil the first one, please. Great. Okay, so we have actually two poll questions here at the same time, so let's go for them both. The first one, yes, no, are you confident that today's younger generations will have the same opportunities that you had? And number two, do you believe it's possible for the UK to be a society where each generation will have better opportunities than its predecessors? If you might give us your responses, please. Yes, so very interesting. Are you confident that today's younger generations will have the same opportunities that you had? 71% said no. And do you believe that it is possible for the UK to be a society where each generation will have better opportunities? 71% said yes. So even though we think today that it might not be possible, we think that it could be, maybe with a little bit of effort. Very interesting results indeed. Let me now begin by just introducing our speaker, Mark Thomas. He is the author of 99%, the book on which the information he's about to share is based on. And if you're interested in purchasing the book, there is a link to do so in the chat window. And I'll also repost that again towards the end so we don't lose track of it all. I'm pretty sure that if you haven't read this book already, by the end of this session, you'll definitely want to have your own copy. I can tell you myself that having read it, the thing that really struck me, in addition to the messages you're going to hear today, is that it's written in a very plain style that's very engaging, and some places has that light touch of humor to really make effective points. Coming back to Mark, let me just introduce him properly now. He spent most of his career in business. For many years, he ran the strategy practice at the PA Consulting Group, a firm that many of you know. And during this time, he began to explore whether the tools and techniques of business strategy could be applied to understanding health and stability of countries. And this research led him to the uncomfortable conclusion that many developed countries, including the US and the UK, are maybe unwittingly pursuing economic policies which result in the unwinding of the 20th century view civilization before we reach the midpoint of 2050, right? So hearteningly, he also concluded that this fate is entirely avoidable. And if you think about the poll questions, I think many of us have a similar feeling, don't we? It's probably worth noting that Mark has written other books besides this one, including The Complete CEO and The Zombie Economy. And he is a visiting professor at the IE Business School, and he has a degree in mathematics from Cambridge University. As you can imagine, if you've written a whole book on the subject, tonight we're only just going to uncover the tip of the iceberg. So do check out the book if you have a chance. So just, Mark, before we leap into the session wholeheartedly, can I just open by asking you a question? Why did you leave consulting and write the book 99%?
Well, it is a funny story, really. So as you've kind of hinted at it in the introduction, as you mentioned, I was running the strategy practice at PA Consulting Group. So as part of that, part of my job was to try and build up networks with senior executives, chief executives and chairmen, etc. And so I did have a reasonable network of that sort of person. And one day, one of my colleagues came to me who ran a different part of the firm, completely different part of the firm, which was very, very successful. It was our defense and security practice, but it didn't have very many top-level contacts in the defense and security space. And he said, well, you seem to have found a way of making top-level contacts in the private sector. Do you think if we work together, we could do it in the defense and security space? So I said, well, quite honestly, I don't know because I haven't tried it, but I can tell you what seems to work in the private sector is we used to do a lot of work jointly with Sir Brian Pittman, who was on the board of one of my clients, and I became friendly with him. So he and I would pick a topic that we thought CEOs ought to be interested in about 3 months' time, and we would research it to death. And then when we'd got the analysis ready, we would hold an evening session, and Brian would do a very quick presentation, and then we would sit down and have about 2.5 hours over dinner with them. And so that was good for them because they got some insights. They liked to hear these topics. They liked the way Brian presented them. They liked to be sitting with each other, and they liked the food and the wine. And we liked it because we got 2.5 hours with chief executives we didn't know. So I said, well, we could try that. We could try just the same thing in the defense and security space. And this was not very long after the Arab Spring had happened. And that had really caught all of our security services and the Foreign Office and so on the back foot. And they really they hadn't anticipated it. They had to scramble massively to reallocate resources to think about how they should respond, what might be going to happen next. So we decided to ask the question, should they have been able to predict it? And at one level, obviously, the answer to that is no, because those of you who remember it will recall that it was actually triggered by the suicide of a Tunisian street vendor called Mohamed Bouazizi, who set himself on fire in the town square because the police had been harassing him and they confiscated his wares and publicly humiliated him. And he just couldn't see a way out, so he doused himself in petrol and set himself on fire. And people had mobile phones, so they took pictures, and those pictures spread around the Arab world. So literally within hours, riots had started in Tunisia. But within the next 12 months, there had been riots and revolutions and uprisings in, I think, 20 countries around the Arab world, and 4 of those actually resulted in regime change. And so at one level, that's completely unpredictable. Who could possibly predict such a thing? But on the other hand, police brutality happens in every country in the world, and there are tragic incidents that happen that shouldn't happen, and usually they don't result in a revolution. So what we asked was a slightly different question. Should they have been able to predict that there were some countries which had reached such a state of instability that a minor, although tragic, incident might be enough to spark a revolution? We came up with a simple mental model. I won't go into it now because otherwise I'll take up too much time, but if you're interested, there's an article on our website called Donuts for Peace, which explains what that model was. It was simple enough that you could carry it around in your head, but it actually turned out to have some degree of predictive capability. So that was quite a good first dinner that we had with them. And so we decided, yeah, we'll repeat this. So we repeated that sort of dinner every 6 months for a while. And after, I don't know how many sessions, we decided to look at rising inequality in the United States and the United Kingdom. And so this is where it really gets to why I decided to leave. So we looked at it, we looked at the data, and when we analysed it, we knew it was a bit disturbing before we started looking, but after we looked, we realised it was extremely disturbing. And so we had the event, and I was so disturbed that I carried on looking. And I basically reached the conclusion that as you said, because the social contract that we've had in place since the Second World War could unwind before we get to the year 2050, which at the time was a radical conclusion, I think. And it was a big shock to me personally, because if I think about my own family, when my parents were born, my grandparents assumed that my parents would have better opportunities, and that was true. And when my brothers and I were born, my parents assumed that we would have better opportunities, and that was true. And when my children were born, I naively assumed that this was like a law of nature, that that's what progress meant, and that my children would have better opportunities. And I became convinced that that law of nature was broken, that progress in the UK and the US had gone into reverse. And the more I thought about it, the less comfortable I was. And so in 2015, I decided to leave consulting to research and write that book, which was finally published in 2019. And because books never change anything on their own, you know, it's obviously good if you write a book that's well received, but even if it's well received, it doesn't actually change anything on its own. So with a handful of others, set up the 99% organization to try to drive change in that direction. I'll come back to what we do at the end, I think.
Definitely, definitely. Well, thanks for sharing your journey of how you got here and how you're now with us today. A lot of what you're saying resonates with me. I have 2 children myself, one of them just entering university and the other in senior school. And I do wonder about, you know, the value for money proposition of a university degree and what kinds of society and opportunities are going to be waiting upon graduation. But I want to pick up on a particular point that you were making, which was that the UK social contract would not survive intact until 2050. That's a pretty bold claim. How did you come to that conclusion?
Well, you say it's a bold claim. Funnily enough, last night, how many of you read the Financial Times? Not very many. Oh, well, I do recommend it. Their chief economics commentator is Martin Wolf, who's just written a new book.
He just wrote a new book and I'm picking it up tonight.
Well, it's a great big fat book. It's about twice the size of mine, but it actually has very, very similar conclusions that there really is a very big risk of us unwinding all these things. And he's picked up most of the same causes for it as well. So now it's probably not so bold, but at the time when I was thinking, should I leave consulting or not? Obviously, I was a bit nervous then, so I should perhaps tell you how I reached that conclusion. So the year was 2015 when I was having to make this decision, and what I realized was that if you think of the time from the end of the Second World War up to the year 2050, it splits very neatly into 3 35-year chunks: 1945 to 1980, 1980 to 2015, which was where I was sitting at the time, and 2015 to 2050. And not only does it split neatly in that sense, but also that the way that most countries ran their economy was different in the first 2 periods. So the immediate post-war period has been called the golden age of capitalism, and the dominant approach by governments around the world could be described as Keynesian. Then after the oil shocks of the 70s, we had, in the UK, we had Margaret Thatcher elected, and in the US, they had Ronald Reagan elected, and introduced a system which in the book I've termed market capitalism, which essentially says, no, you know, this idea that government is the solution is wrong. Government's the problem, not the solution. That was Reagan who said that, I think. But Thatcher had very, very similar views. And their attitude really was that the magic of market forces is what's going to solve our problems. The job of government is to get out of the way. They shouldn't be regulating any more than strictly necessary. They shouldn't be taxing. They certainly shouldn't be in the business of doing things, providing goods and services. The market can do all that much better. And so we had those two quite different mindsets, which also corresponded with those 35-year periods. And what I had always been told was that, actually the post-war period was not great for the US and the UK. And luckily, along came Thatcher and Reagan and produced 20 years of prosperity. So I was quite shocked when I started to look at the data, which I will start to share with you. So this is a comparison for the US and for the UK of most of the major economic indicators. So as you would expect, the golden age is as close as I could get to gold, and the age of market capitalism is in blue. There's one data point missing for the UK because median household income growth, they don't go back that far in the ONS, unfortunately. So we don't have that, but you can see all the others. And essentially, the message is very, very clear in terms of overall economic growth. In both the US and the UK, the golden age was better. In terms of things that directly affect people, median household income growth was vastly better in the US in the golden age. It hardly grew at all in the age of market capitalism. And it's even worse if you look at median wages in the US. They were basically flat for about 40 years. Long-term unemployment was much lower in the US and even more so in the UK. The only thing which was better in the age of market capitalism has been inflation. So it's been an effective way of containing inflation. But these other figures above, the median household income growth and the GDP numbers, those are all real numbers. So they're inflation adjusted. So even when you take the inflation into account, the actual performance and people's lived experience was better under the golden age. So that was the first shock. And then if we look at the UK specifically, these are more recent data, but it's just interesting how far we have fallen behind what we used to think of as our peers. So on the x-axis here, we've got actual data, which is 2016 to 2021 from the IMF. And here we've got also got the IMF's estimates up to 2024. But it doesn't matter whether you really, it's basically the same picture on both axes. They're not all quite in a straight line, but you can see that we have been falling and look as if we're continuing to fall behind our peers. This is quite a long time period, so that starts to make a big difference. There is one group of people for whom things have been much, much better in the age of market capitalism, which is the top 1% of the population. So if you had complete equality of wealth, which you couldn't have and probably wouldn't even want to have, but if you could, then the top 1% would have 1% of the wealth. But what you can see is that if you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, they had about 70% of the wealth. So they had about 70 times more than their basic share would have been. And that had been falling very steadily until around about 1980. And then since then, it has been on a gradual upward trend. So that means if you're in the top 1%, actually your personal experience is okay, because even though overall the economy is not doing so well, you're getting a bigger slice of it, and that still feels okay. But if you're not, then it really isn't. So if you take median wages, this is a couple of years old now, but the median earner was earning just under 25,000. Had they been on pre-2010 trends, that wouldn't have been 25,000, it would have been nearly 35,000. If we'd had the level of growth that we had, which is lower, but fixed inequality, then it would still have been nearly 30,000. But because we also have had growing inequality over that time, what we've seen is that the median wage by 2050 on that rate would have fallen to under 20,000. So these numbers are all real. So that means that by 2050, on those trends, we would be seeing people having lost 20% of their income. But if we couple that with permanent austerity, which is a real risk post-COVID, then we could be looking at a figure more like 16,000, which is not very far away from today's median wage. So today's poverty rate. The most common definition of poverty rate is that it's 60% of median wage. So we could be looking by 2050 at a society where half the population is below or not very far above today's poverty rate. Actually, the poverty rate itself would have fallen because it's calculated at 60% of the median. We've already started to see that. But this is the risk. So that's an extrapolation, not a forecast. But it does say if we don't do something to change direction, that's a possibility. If you think what that would feel like, that's a country where you've got a small number of people who are very, very wealthy, and most of the rest are in or near poverty. That's like a description of South Africa today, which is currently the world's most unequal country. You've got an elite who live surrounded by security to protect themselves from the masses. So we're used to not being that kind of country. We're used to being a civilized Northern European country. But I just thought I'd finish this part by showing you this from the FT quite recently. Some of you will have seen this article. I think the headline was something like the US and the UK are poor countries with some rich people. And this is a bit of a shock. So if you look at the dotted line, that's the average of developed countries. So you can see that for our median earners, they are and have been and are getting further away from the average of developed countries. But what's really striking to me is if you see they picked on Slovenia as a comparator. So Slovenia is not a country that I would have said would historically have been a benchmark that we would aspire to be catching up to, but actually in terms of the 5th percentile and the 10th percentile, those people in Slovenia are already richer than their equivalents in the UK. And possibly this year or next year, again, that would be an extrapolation rather than a forecast, but very plausibly, in a very short time, the median earner in Slovenia would be better off than the median earner in the United Kingdom.
So Mark, just to dwell on that for a moment, you were saying in some of your earlier remarks that these observations, all may not be lost. It may not be inevitable. So if that's, that's great, if that's true, what can you tell us about that? Is it true?
Well, I believe it's true, and I was very heartened to see that 71% of the audience believed it's true, that it's not inevitable. So, you can see these lines, you can see these trends. They look extremely dire, but they're dire for a reason. They're dire because of things we've done, policies that we've enacted that other countries haven't enacted. That's why our results are different from other countries. So if we change the policies, there is hope. So I think it's a really important question that you've just asked. If it were inevitable, then those of us that want to look after our families would have to either make sure that we're in the top 1%, which is a good strategy, but by definition, it's only a strategy that 1% of the population can possibly succeed with, or emigrate. And being left with that choice is pretty grim. So I think it's really very good news that it is not inevitable. I think we can, and therefore we should, turn the country round. And to see that, there are really two obvious ways of looking at it. One is something we've just started doing, which is looking at what other countries are achieving today, but also looking at what we have achieved in this country at other times. So I won't spend a lot of time on the other country part, because it would take a long time to go into it in detail. But if you benchmark on the sorts of things that matter to people, median incomes, poverty rates, social mobility, life expectancy, even things like corruption, you can see that some other countries have been doing, relatively speaking, better than we have. I mean, I should point out that we're comparing ourselves here against the developed countries. We're not comparing ourselves against all the other countries. There are about 200 countries in the world. So this chart that we were just looking at, we are much, much better than these countries, and they haven't got them all on here, but as I say, there are about 200 countries. We're still better than most of them. The danger is that we slip out of being a civilized one. So what I've got on these charts, and I'll just quickly go through them. I don't know if you're aware of the World Happiness Report, which comes out every year. They produce a World Happiness Index with a score, and it tends to be the same countries up who are at the top. And what I found interesting when I looked at these things was there's often a strong correlation between the happiness index and some sort of economic measure. So these, I think, were the 10 unhappiest countries. Here were the developed ones, or the big ones, sorry, the biggest economies, whether or not they were in the top 10. And here were the top 10 in terms of happiness. And you can see there really does appear to be quite a good link with per capita GDP. So if you don't grow the economy, it's harder to keep your population happy. With median disposable income, again, you can see there's a pretty strong correlation there that, broadly speaking, the happiest countries are the ones with the highest median disposable incomes. With poverty rates, again, there's quite a strong correlation there that people like living in a country with a low poverty rate. But also, if you look, there just aren't that many countries whose poverty rate is below 15%. You really are into quite a small group of what you could call really high-performing countries there. And again, here's life expectancy. So probably no surprises here, except for the fact that in all of these things, you know, the UK is in the mid-performers. It's not in among the high performers. So if we wanted to turn the country around, the obvious thing to do would be to think about looking at some of these countries and understanding, you know, what is it that Denmark's doing. Norway, you could say, well, they've got some structural advantages that we can't replicate, but what's Denmark doing? What's the Netherlands doing that we haven't been doing? Those sorts of questions would be interesting. And of course, we should be benchmarking very much along these lines of just checking how we're sharing the national pie. So there's all of that, which indicates that there are other countries that we should be feeling that they're our peers, that we should be able to find ways of learning from and doing better. The other thing that I personally find a source of real hope is thinking about what happened after the Second World War. Because we're constantly told yes, it would be nice to fund the NHS properly, but we can't with the level of national debt and all that sort of thing. But let's just think about the state of the UK after the Second World War. Debt to GDP was over 250% then. So it was double, basically double as a percentage of GDP what it is today. The cost of servicing that debt was over 5% of GDP. More than half of GDP had been diverted to the war effort. 5 million people who should otherwise have been working, doing productive things, had been mobilized into the armed forces, and about 5% of national wealth had been destroyed, and indeed 1% of the population had been lost. So that was a pretty grim situation, and you would think today's politicians would be saying, well, you know, that Beveridge report, which was produced in 1942, that Beveridge report is lovely, but, you know, it's utopian idealism to think that we could do it now in the state that we are. Let's keep it on the shelf for a generation and see if we can afford it then. But they didn't do that. They implemented it. And when I think about why that happened, I think it's because there was a very different zeitgeist after the Second World War, on two dimensions. One of them was hope, that at the beginning of the Second World War, people in Britain were virtually certain that we were going to lose. Even if you listen to Churchill's famous speech about fighting in the hedges and the ditches, if you read it all the way to the end, it's very clear that he was actually thinking that Nazi Germany might well conquer mainland Britain, and there would be a government in exile somewhere in Canada or the States or something, and in the end we would come back. It's quite a daunting speech if you read it to the end. So people were pretty certain, and he was obviously at the more optimistic end of the spectrum, were pretty certain that we were going to lose. And then after the Battle of Britain, we had control over our airspace, and they realized, well, actually, we probably aren't going to lose, but we might not be able to win. And then gradually it became clear that, especially after America had joined in, that actually we probably were going to win, and then we had won. So the national mood had gone from despair to hope, and the idea was well ingrained that we could do incredibly difficult things. The other dimension is about solidarity. There had been a lot of shared sacrifice during the Second World War. At least in principle, everybody was in it together. It wasn't conscription of the poor. Rich people had their sons particularly, but also their daughters conscripted. Rich people, at least in principle, were subject to the same rationing as poor people. I'm sure they found some ways around it in cases, but in principle, everybody made shared sacrifices. I don't know if it's true or not, but it was said that the royal family donned their underwear during the war. So there was a real sense of everybody being in it together. And that combination is very, very powerful. And it meant that the government did take what I guess was a gamble and created the welfare state, created the NHS, and ushered in what we've just seen was the golden age of capitalism. I didn't show you the period before that, but actually, if you look at, you can from the Bank of England get 800 years of economic data. The golden age is the most successful age in our economic history.
So just to pause you there, Mark,
yeah,
and to reflect on everything that you've just said, clearly noting where we were in that period after the Second World War, allows us to see that there is a basis for the hope and encouragement that you were talking about earlier. So you've got a small army of management consultants here with you.
Yeah.
And, reflecting upon all of us here, what can we do to help protect the UK social contract? How could we do that? What could our contribution look like?
Very good question. Let me just tell you a tiny bit about what 99% is doing, and then we can explore together how consultants can help. Actually, consultants are already helping a lot because we have a lot of members who are consultants. Let I'll just share again. You don't want to see that. We set up the organisation, as I mentioned, in 2019. It's an all-volunteer organisation. It's not quite literally true, but it has very close to zero income and very close to zero outgoing. So everybody is a volunteer. We've got 3,700 volunteers, all helping in different ways, some much more actively than others, to preserve the UK's social contract and to keep us as one of those leading civilized countries. So in the long term, that means system change. And in the short term, that means combating the most damaging legislation and trying to make sure there's a change of government which is prepared to do those things. So we do a lot to try to raise awareness. There's the book, of course. We are active on social media and increasingly in new media. We have regular articles. We have meetings of ourselves, and we have public events like this one to try to raise awareness, because one of the biggest barriers to change is, I think, simply lack of awareness. So raising awareness is powerful. The other thing is we've got 5 projects running, which are aimed at specific aspects of the problem. We have one which is aimed at younger people under 30, called 99% Rising, because when we looked at the Brexit vote, we found that although young people were very strongly in favour of remaining, they hadn't actually got out and voted. If you look at the numbers, it's striking that even if they had voted at the same proportion as the over 75s, we would still be in the EU today. We have one which is about saving the NHS, which is a critical part of the post-war social contract, and which I think is under very grave threat at the moment. We have a project about supporting local campaigning. We have a project about tackling externalization. So if you're a business, the story is, of course, that if you behave ethically, that's good for business. The reality is that's not always the case. In fact, it can be very, very profitable if you can externalize your costs, which means that you get the rest of society to pick up some of your costs. So, for example, if I run a business and I don't pay my staff a living wage, they're still alive, but somebody else is paying part of that. It might be they're getting in-work benefits, which is quite a big thing nowadays, or it might be that the bank of mum and dad is subsidising them, but somebody else is subsidising your wage bill. If I have people who are who've been educated in this country at the taxpayer's expense, but all my profits are actually made in the Cayman Islands, so I don't pay any tax on them. I've externalized the cost. I'm getting all the benefit of that education, but I'm not helping to support it. If I pollute the environment and I contribute to climate change, it might be cheaper for me, but the rest of society picks up the cost. So ideally changing the accounting system to prevent that would be a very powerful way of aligning a profit motive with what's actually good for society. And we have a project which is just trying to apply these sorts of ideas on a micro scale in the county of Herefordshire, because that's where I happen to live. So that's what we're doing. And I think consultants can be very, very helpful in all sorts of ways. Firstly, just simply because of the range of skills. All of those skills and many others that I haven't listed are extremely valuable in tackling different aspects of this challenge. Also, in terms of contacts, consultants, not all consultants, but some consultants are very well connected with the kinds of people that can influence this change. So both as individuals, it's worth thinking how can you help, and if you've got a bit of time, we would welcome your input in helping to raise awareness, helping to drive some of those projects. But also when you're working with clients, can you help? Can you help your clients to understand these issues? Well, I'll tell you an example of something I did which was a failure, but if it had worked, it would have been good. So I had a client who was on the board of a large UK retailer, and at that time, about £1 in 8 that was spent on the British High Street went through this particular retailer. And I said, well, you should at least think about campaigning to raise the minimum wage. And my reasoning for that was that obviously if one retailer starts to pay above the minimum wage, but the others don't, it raises its own cost base. It doesn't raise its competitors' cost base, and it is going to start losing out in profitability terms, and the CEO will get the sack. But if they were all doing it, then suddenly you've got quite a lot more money going into the pockets of people on minimum wage. And money that goes into the pockets of people on minimum wage gets spent very quickly. And 1 in 8 of those pounds would have come back to this particular retailer. So depending on quite how many people they had on minimum wage, it could have been a profitable thing for them to campaign to change the system, to level the playing field. But it's hard to get people to think about systemic issues, to look beyond the boundary of their own business. So those are just a few ideas. I think you know more about consulting than I do, because I haven't been a consultant really for 8 years. So I think you know more than me about how you can help.
No, that's you've already given us some really good food for thought about how we could leap in here. Before we open up for Q&A, I just wanted to give the floor back to Nick for a moment to just share some CMCE news with our audience. Nick?
Just a couple of things that are coming up in just under a month's time. We have another one of these sessions which kind of relates to what we've been talking about, particularly in the last couple of comments on systemic issues. So we are very pleased to have Patrick Hofferstadt, who is a systems thinking expert and author of another book that's sitting on my desk on systems thinking and approaches. As some of you know, it's not a new thing. We've been talking about systems approaches for a long time, but they don't really seem to have found their way into the consulting mainstream perhaps as much as they should. So this is an opportunity to find out how that way of thinking about problems is applicable to the here and now. So details on our website. And then the other thing that I wanted to mention is that we are launching an associate membership scheme, and this allows you an opportunity to engage with people within the network, perhaps on a more kind of detailed level, and get engaged with some of the content and the arguments that we're trying to unpack. And you can do that by going to LinkedIn and looking up CMCE Associates. It is, and that will take you to the group. It's a LinkedIn group, and you can ask to be a member, and our membership committee, which I think is me at the moment, will vet that and almost certainly let you in.
Right. So some of you have been typing away in the chat window for some questions. So Mark, get ready. Here's the first one for you. Given that the only benefit of the market capitalism era was to reduce inflation, should reducing inflation be Jeremy Hunt's #1 priority? Mark?
I don't think it should. I think the kind of inflation that we've got at the moment is caused, in particular, it's been caused by energy prices, which is a global issue. It's not caused by people in the UK having too much money to spend and driving the price up. It's a supply side problem. It's global. So if you treat it as though it's because people in the UK have too much money and you raise interest rates to make them curtail their spending, you've misunderstood the nature of the problem. You'll cause a lot of hardship to those people, and it won't really make any difference to what's happening to the global oil prices. So I think it's the wrong approach altogether.
Thank you.
It's also worth noting that the way that other countries have responded is different. So we have the highest energy prices in the world. Other countries have tried to contain inflation by directly targeting the things that are growing fastest. Now, our government has actually said the things that are growing fastest, like energy prices, we're not going to do so much to cap them. We're not going to cap bankers' bonuses. We will cap the things that have not been growing at the rate of inflation, like nurses' pay and firefighters' pay. So if you think of inflation, it's calculated as an average. Most countries therefore would say, well, let's target these things that have been growing at above average and try and stop them, because that's what's pulling it up. But we're saying, no, we're going to let them, they can carry on as high as they like because they're our donors, but we're going to counterbalance that by pushing down on the bits that are already falling in real terms after inflation.
Thank you. So we have a couple of questions that are related to each other, so I'm going to read them out together, and then you can respond. So one of them is, how could we have applied influence to stop idiocratic policies being implemented? And there's a follow-up question to this, which is really interesting. You would hope that a functioning democracy would correct over time these trends. After all, you would not expect turkeys to vote for Christmas. However, I fear we are seeing here a symptom of democracy that is not functioning as it should, perhaps related to a lack of access to the right information on which to make, in quote unquote, informed decisions. What are your thoughts about those things, Mark?
Well, I think that is exactly right. A functioning democracy requires that people are able to understand what is in their own interests and vote for it. Otherwise, of course, if the turkeys are told that inside this house is a lovely turkey spa where they're going to be treated better than ever before, of course they will vote to go into the abattoir. When they get there, then it's too late. So we are on the receiving end of a lot of misinformation in this country, both in the mainstream media and on social media. So the mainstream media, if you measure it by readership, about 80% of the mainstream media are owned by either Lord Rothermere, Rupert Murdoch, Lord Lebedev, or Frederick Berkeley. That accounts for about 80% of readers. Now, all of those people are non-domiciled for tax purposes and extreme right-wing. They're people who support the market fundamentalist agenda. So if you get your information from them, you're automatically very likely to be getting information that tells you that the market fundamentalist approach is the right one, and if things aren't right, then it's either because we haven't done enough market fundamentalism, which is Liz Truss's position, or because of immigrants or the EU or somebody else is to blame, but it's not the fault of the policies that we've been adopting. And then on social media, it's even more complex because those media have algorithms which can be exploited, and even if they're not exploited, they produce bubbles. So I mentioned this book launch I was at last night. There was another speaker who was the dean of the Blavatnik Business School, and she mentioned this MP who had been talking about TikTok, obviously didn't quite understand how the algorithm worked. And apparently he said, I don't understand why anybody spends time on TikTok. It seems to be just full of naked teenage girls. And of course, the reason that he said that was because the algorithm responds to what you respond to. And if you keep clicking on the teenage girls, you will get nothing but teenage girls. He didn't realize that. But it's a serious point, though, actually, because while we may not all do it with teenage girls, we all do it with something. And we don't see, I do spend quite a bit of time on Twitter because that's actually how we do a lot of our recruitment. I don't see Twitter, I see my corner of Twitter. And it's very different from other corners. Occasionally I get a little glimpse of other corners, but mostly I don't see it. So it's become, unfortunately, hard work for a British citizen to find out the truth. So
just to come in on that, I recently read something by Johann Hari, who made very similar point and actually talked about the design of social media technology and how the algorithms are specifically engineered in the way that you're suggesting, which puts you in a place where you corroborate your own thinking and don't always get exposed to alternative views or information.
Well,
So,
not only that, but
compelling remarks there.
If I had enough money, I could on social media surround you with a wall of misinformation.
Oh, sure, yeah, of course. But you don't actually need a lot of you don't need a wall of money to do that. I mean, it can be done anyway. But
yeah.
Just noting the time, Mark.
Yes.
Let me move on to another question for you. How do we break the myth and narrative that if we increase pay for nurses and public sector employees, it will cause inflation? Therefore, the public good the government is controlling, public but not private pay?
Well, I partly answered that before. So nurses and other public sector workers, actually their pay is one of the things that's been holding down inflation because it's been below inflation, which means in real terms, they've been getting poorer since 2010. The things that are causing the inflation, by definition, are the prices that have been rising faster. If the government was serious, as many other countries' governments are, they'd be targeting the things that are rising faster. They wouldn't be asking the most vulnerable in society to pay the price. That would be my suggestion for how to tackle the narrative.
That's interesting. Thank you. I have one last question for you before we close. And I'm just going to read it out as it is. I may have misheard, but if so, with regards to the hollowing out of the public sector over the last 13 years, how do you think management consultants can actually help turn this around or exacerbating the problem? What are your thoughts?
It's probably easier to exacerbate it because you could probably get outsourcing contracts to do all sorts of things that might actually exacerbate the problem. I think I do think awareness raising is a very, very important thing that we can all do. And that includes with our clients that when I think back to my time in consulting up till the global financial crisis, I thought my job was to understand my client's business and the sector they were in. And if I understood those dynamics, I was doing well and I would give them good advice. And then I realized when the global financial crisis happened that, well, actually, that's not really right, because I had assumed that the rest of the economy was being well run, and in particular, things like the banking sector was being properly regulated. And if I hadn't made that assumption, then I would have been able to give my clients better advice. So you've got an upcoming thing on systems thinking. I think thinking about much bigger systems than the individual client's business is a very, very powerful contribution that consultants can make when they get that opportunity. And I think I gave this example of the retailer. If that retailer had realized that they had the power not just to influence their own business, but that they could change the system in a way that was good for society, that would have been a really powerful action. That would have it would have helped a huge number of people in this country, and possibly, maybe it wouldn't have done. They didn't even do the analysis, but quite possibly it would have been a very easy profit and revenue boost for them. It would certainly have been a revenue boost.
Thank you. Mark, we're just now at the top of the hour. On behalf of all of us, I want to say thank you so much for sharing all that you have about not just about the contents of your book, but over your years of rich experience in exploring what clearly are emotive issues that are we really seem to be at a crossroad about, don't we?
Well, absolutely.
I want to remind everybody here that the book can be purchased. The link is in the chat. And also there are some additional pieces of information that are available here on Mark's website, www.99percent.org. And that link is also in the chat. So if this is a compelling topic that you want to explore even further, we would invite you for both of those things.
Yeah, and could I just add one further invitation, which is we have meetings for members. You don't have to promise anything. You don't have to do anything. You can just come along and hear what's going on. So if you're intrigued but you don't want to commit, can I invite you to come along to one of the meetings and hear a little bit more? And if you do want to commit, then just let us know.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We are
Ladies and
keeping
gentlemen,
keeping the call open for a little bit if anyone wants to stay on and chat. It's the attempt to implement the after talk meeting networking with a glass of wine. But
I will leave the audience in your capable hands, Nick. Once again, thank you very much indeed, Mark.
Thank you.